Many modern-day historians tell us that our nation's founding fathers were a diverse group of atheists, deists, and political revolutionaries. So where did they find the common ground and the inspiration for the ideas that birthed the most successful nation in history? Did their faith play a role in our nation's founding ideas? Do we have, as many historians claim, a godless constitution? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series. A closer look into our nation's history reveals that our nation's founding fathers were united by their deeply spiritual beliefs that shaped the foundation of America. But many modern historians tell us just the opposite. Who were our founding fathers? How did their faith play a role in the ideas that birthed America? And do we have, as many historians claim, a godless constitution? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Consider the Declaration of Independence. No nation has ever been as long under the same piece of paper as America has under the Declaration. In fact, just look at some of the other nations. France had their revolution more than a decade after America did, and they're now in their 15th constitution. Brazil has had 7 constitutions since 1822. Poland has had 6 since 1921. Afghanistan has had 5 since 1923. Russia has had 4 just since 1918, and the story is the same for other nations as well. This type of instability has characterized nations in Europe, Africa, South America, and the rest of the world except America. America's been blessed beyond what most Americans recognize.
Right.
We have a stability that we're not even aware of. Across the world they know that. But any given year at the United Nations, the number of nations goes up and down in count because of civil wars or revolutions or someone's been absorbed by someone else. We haven't had a revolution in America since 1776. We've been under the same piece of paper since then. No other nation's ever done that. I mean, this is unbelievable what we have. Way back in 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came to America, who observed us, who wrote about us, said this. He said, "The position of the Americans is quite exceptional. It's to be believed that no other democratic people would be placed in a similar situation." And that's what's called American exceptionalism. And America is exceptional. And you can take that 2 ways. You can really be proud of that, but the Founding Fathers took it a different way. They took it as a source of national humility. If we've been blessed, if we've been exceptional, it's been because of God's hand. John Adams gave a great national proclamation. He said the only source of national security is in our recognition of our humble dependence on Him. So this American exceptionalism that we have really ties back to our dependence on and our acknowledgement of God's hand in our affairs.
American exceptionalism, okay? Just redefine that for me.
American exceptionalism really means that we're exceptional among the nations of the world. And that's not an attitude, that's a statement of fact.
Okay.
We've had one revolution since 1776. We are the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. We've been under the same piece of paper all that period of time. No other nation's done that. That makes us exceptional. Now, that's not a source of pride to say, oh, we're better than the rest of the world. We're exceptional because we have unique ideas. If you look in our documents, we put ideas in those documents that had never before been placed in any written government document. You cannot find inalienable rights in a government document until we did it.
Wow.
We said, you know, there's certain rights that you as individuals have that government cannot touch, and we're telling government it has to leave those rights alone. The fact that we drew a clear line between government and the people and said, now government can do these things, but you can't touch life. You can't touch liberty.
Right.
You can't touch revolutionary ideas. Now, that's part of why we've been exceptional for all this period of time. Another thing that we have is the consent of the governed. Back then, that was a revolutionary idea.
Yeah.
You didn't have the consent of the government. You had what the king told you to do. I mean, that was the only option you had. So now we're saying, no, government is the consent of the governed. You have to have our permission as government to do things. Revolutionary idea. It's made America exceptional.
Now, isn't that really what we're discussing right now? What ideas
Yes.
were in the Founding Fathers to make us exceptional?
You have a radical idea with separation of powers. The idea that we're going to make three branches separate, because the governments back then, judiciary was under the king. Parliament, legislature was under the king. You had one head. There were branches, but they weren't separated.
Right.
So the idea we have of separating branches, putting them wide apart, revolutionary stuff. And then on top of that, to make sure they stayed separated, we gave checks and balances.
Wow.
Another revolutionary idea that says, all right, because we don't want one branch running the other two, we're giving you ways to defend yourself against these two. We incorporated in the Constitution what Alexander Hamilton called constitutional arms of self-defense. Every branch had a way to defend itself against the encroachments of the other branches. Revolutionary ideas. We take it for granted today. We think, oh, everybody does that. No, everyone doesn't do that. And then on top of that, we threw in a really novel idea called republicanism. It's in our Constitution, Article 4, Section 4. We get to have elections at the local, county, state, and federal levels every time we have elections. Now, you point to anywhere else in the world that was doing that back then. I mean, these are radical ideas. They're what made America exceptional. We still embrace these ideas. We still have a stable form of government. So where did our founders get their ideas that made the Declaration the most successful government document in the history of the world? They themselves answered that question. Founders like James Otis, who was the mentor of both Samuel Adams and John Hancock, declared that, quote,
"The authority of Mr. Locke has been preferred to all others."
Declaration signers such as John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Rush, and many others, similarly sang the praises of John Locke. And John Quincy Adams declared, quote,
"The Declaration of Independence was founded upon one of the same theory of government, expounded in the writings of Locke."
Clearly, John Locke had a huge political influence in America. Interestingly, critics today call Locke a deist, but this is completely erroneous. Not only was John Locke considered a theologian by previous generations, but he even wrote a verse-by-verse commentary on Paul's epistles and compiled a topical Bible, which he called a commonplace book to the Holy Bible. It listed the verses in the Bible subject by subject. And when the anti-religious Enlightenment thinkers attacked Christianity, Locke defended it in his book, The Reasonableness of Christianity as Delivered in the Scriptures. And then when he was attacked for defending Christianity in that first work, he responded with the work of Vindication of the Reasonableness of Christianity. Still being attacked, 2 years later, Locke wrote a second Vindication of the Reasonableness of Christianity. No wonder earlier generations considered him a theologian. However, the writing of John Locke that most influenced the founders' philosophy in the Declaration of Independence is this work, The Two Treatises of Civil Government by John Locke. In fact, signer of the Declaration, Richard Henry Lee, declared that the Declaration itself was, quote, copied from Locke's treatise on government. This is an amazing book. It's less than 400 pages long. It's only 1.25 inches thick. Yet Locke refers to the Bible some 1,500 times in this one book in order to show the proper operation of civil government. And this is the primary work influencing the Declaration of Independence. No wonder it's been such a successful document. And how about the Constitution? It's been so successful that America is now the longest ongoing constitutional republic in the history of the world. Our Constitution was an original and unique American document. It was not a compilation of the best clauses of other constitutions from across the world. No, our Constitution contained ideas that had not before appeared in written constitutions. New and novel practices like the separation of powers and checks and balances. Practices like republicanism.
A closer look into our nation's history reveals that our nation's founding fathers were united by their deeply spiritual beliefs that shaped the foundation of America. But many modern historians tell us just the opposite. Who were our founding fathers? How did their faith play a role in the ideas that birthed America? And do we have, as many historians claim, a godless Constitution? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
if those ideas are written down in our Constitution, in other documents, where were they thinking this stuff up if it was so new and so fresh back then?
These revolutionary ideas that the Founding Fathers placed in our documents came from a primary source. A primary source was the Bible.
Wow.
Say, oh, no, that's not possible. The Bible's not political. Time out. Let's do a little historical analysis here.
Okay.
What you have is we have in American history thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of written documents. Previous generations did on paper what we do with cameras and tapes and VCRs. They wrote everything down. They all kept diaries and memoirs, and George Washington has 100 volumes of writings, and John Adams has 33, and Jefferson has 60. They wrote it all down. One of the things they kept written records of was sermons, because unlike today, sermons back then were all written. You didn't just stand up in the pulpit and preach a sermon. You stood up in the pulpit and you read a sermon. It was not until the Second Great Awakening that we started having extemporary kind of sermons where you would actually preach a sermon without having it written out first.
Wow.
So we have tens of thousands of written sermons out of the colonial times. You will find there is nothing covered in the Declaration of Independence that had not already been dealt with in the pulpit before 1763.
Who were some of those people?
Wow.
Well, a great example. Take the Declaration of Independence. All these ideas, the consent of the governed and taxation without representation, all these things that came out in the Declaration, you can track so many of them back to the Reverend John Wise. The Reverend John Wise is a name we never hear about today. Now, Clinton Roster is an award-winning American historian. He wrote a book called The Seed Time of the Republic.
Wow.
What are the ideas that birthed the revolution? He tracked it back to 6 individuals. He considered these 6 individuals to be the greatest intellectual influence on American independence. Of the 6 individuals, 2 were political folks and 4 were preachers of the gospel. One of the preachers he points to is the Reverend John Wise. Now, this is the work from Reverend John Wise. This is his work from 1710 and 1717, two works that he has here. Reverend Wise is a preacher in Massachusetts, and by 1687 he had already shown out of the Bible that taxation without representation was tyranny. He had already shown and preached out of the Bible that the consent of the governed is the basis of biblical government. He had already shown out of the Bible that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain rights. Now, that sounds like things in the Declaration. Yeah, exactly. It was preached in the pulpit by the Reverend John Wise. This particular edition of his works that I'm holding here is from 1772. And what makes this significant is in 1772 they reprinted his works. Who reprinted it? Well, you can take folks like Ebenezer Dorr. Ebenezer Dorr is the guy who rode with Paul Revere to sound the alarm. You can take the guy who was head of the Boston Tea Party. He's the guy who reprinted this book. Artemus Ward, who was the first commander-in-chief before George Washington was appointed as commander-in-chief, he reprinted this book. You find the guys who reprinted the 1772 book were the guys who led the American Revolution. When this book came out in 1772, it sold out so fast they did another quick reprinting. This went to all the patriots. It renewed their thinking. Oh yeah, that's right. Taxation without representation is tyranny. The consent of the government came right out of those sermons. And we used to know that. Matter of fact, in 1926, President Calvin Coolidge, President in 1926, well, that's the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He gave an oration at Independence Hall where they signed the Declaration, 150th birthday. He points out that the Reverend John Wise is the guy who came up with most of the ideas in the Declaration. He just reads out of Wise's works and he reads out of the Declaration. We don't know that today. We didn't know that preachers, that the pulpit had an impact on our rights that we have in our documents. So what were the sources for the founders' successful ideas? Political science professors believe that they could answer this question. If they could assemble a broad spectrum of writings from the founding era and see who or what was being quoted in those writings, then they could identify the source for many of the unique political ideas embraced during the founding era. The researchers therefore assembled 15,000 representative writings from that period, searched those writings, and isolated 3,154 direct quotes. They traced those quotes back to their original sources, thereby identifying the most frequently cited sources of the founding era. The result is recorded here in this work, The Origins of American Constitutionalism. The researchers discovered that the single individual cited most often during the founding era was political philosopher Charles Montesquieu, with 8.3% of the quotes being taken from his writings from the 1750s. Legal scholar William Blackstone was the second most cited individual, with 7.9% of the quotes being taken from his writings in the 1760s. And political philosopher and theologian John Locke was third, with 2.9% of the quotes being taken from his writings in the 1680s and 1690s. These were the three most frequently cited individuals during the founding era. But the researchers discovered that the single most cited source was the Bible, with 34% of the quotes being taken from the Scriptures. Significantly, that percentage is even higher when the source of the ideas used by individuals such as Montesquieu and Blackstone and Locke are identified and included. Consider, for example, a primary source of Blackstone's ideas. This massive set is Blackstone's most famous work, his Commentaries on the Laws. First introduced in 1766, this became the final word in American courts, and it remained a primary legal source until well into the 20th century. This was used to define words, establish procedure, and settle disputes. So what was a primary source for Blackstone's ideas? The answer is evident when going through his works, but the testimony of Charles Finney also provides a clear indication. Finney, a university president, educator, and civil rights leader, was probably best known for being a famous preacher during one of America's great revivals, the Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s. In his autobiography, Finney recounted his early desire to become an attorney. So like all other law students at that time, he began studying Blackstone's commentaries. As Blackstone covered the various legal concepts, he frequently presented the biblical ideas on which the laws were based. Finney stated that in the process of studying Blackstone, he read so much of the Bible that he became a Christian and received his call to the ministry. Clearly, a major source of Blackstone's ideas was the Bible. And a survey of the writings of Montesquieu and Locke confirms a similar and sometimes even a stronger biblical influence on their writings. So while 34% of the quotes in the representative writings of the founding era came directly from the Bible, many of the other quotes were taken from writers who, like Blackstone, had used the Bible to help arrive at their own conclusions. The Bible was far and away the most influential source of ideas in the founding era.
Okay, the bomb that you've dropped on us today is that basically the original concept came from the pulpit, came from preachers.
Came from preachers.
What's made it so successful?
Well, John Adams, one of the guys, we talked about the fact that John Adams was one of the prolific writers in the American Revolution. John Adams, in his writings, when he was asked who's behind American independence, he said, if you want to know who's behind American independence, he said, you have the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper and the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew, and you also have the Reverend George Whitefield, the Reverend Charles Chauncey, and we're going, who are they? Americans might have heard of George Whitefield. The chances that they've heard of Charles Chauncey or Jonathan Mayhew or Samuel Cooper are slim to none.
Wow.
And yet the patriots themselves, John Adams said these are the guys behind independence. Matter of fact, this is one of the sermons that led to independence. This is a sermon by the Reverend Charles Chauncey. He's cited by Adams as one of the guys. This is from 1765.
Wow.
This is a sermon on the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act that the British had done, and which eventually led to the Boston Tea Party. Said, here's a preacher stand up and say, no, 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 the Stamp Act is not biblical. Here's what the Bible says about taxes. This is an anti-biblical tax. It means going after taxes. Well, when the Stamp Act got repealed in 1765, and by the way, part of the repeal of the Stamp Act, we learn in our textbooks that Benjamin Franklin went to Parliament in Great Britain to argue against the Stamp Act. What we don't hear is the person who went with them into Parliament to argue against the Stamp Act. That person was the Reverend George Whitefield. So the two people you have arguing against the Stamp Act, Ben Franklin, good guy, also George Whitefield, preacher of the gospel. Textbooks don't talk about Whitefield. Historical documents are clear.
A closer look into our nation's history reveals that our nation's founding fathers were united by their deeply spiritual beliefs that shaped the foundation of America. But many modern historians tell us just the opposite. Who were our founding fathers? How did their faith play a role in the ideas that birthed America? And do we have, as many historians claim, a godless constitution? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Isaiah 33:22 sets forth three distinct branches of government, just as was adopted in the Constitution. And the logic for the separation of powers was based on teachings derived from Jeremiah 17:9, and the basis of tax exemptions for churches. Exemptions given us by the Founding Fathers themselves can be found in Ezra 7:24, and there are many other examples of American government adopting biblical patterns and precedents. In fact, the biblical underpinnings of America were so obvious to previous generations that in 1892, even the U.S. Supreme Court had no difficulty in rendering a unanimous decision with what may be a surprising declaration for us today. No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation. What would lead the U.S. Supreme Court to conclude that? The answer is simple: America's own history. The court's decision in that case was only 16 pages long, but in those 16 pages, the court provided almost 80 different historical precedents proving that America was indeed a Christian nation. The court referenced the Founding Fathers, the acts of Congress and the state governments, previous court decisions, and many other official actions to reach its conclusion that America was indeed a Christian nation. 80 precedents in a case is impressive, but it's also important because courts base their decisions on precedent. This enables them to be consistent from ruling to ruling, thus contributing to a stable society. Significantly, that 1892 court decision was by no means the only Supreme Court decision that recognized and preserved America's biblical heritage. Similar decisions were rendered both before and after that 1892 ruling. For example, in 1844, a case was brought before the Supreme Court involving this Philadelphia school. Originally founded by a wealthy French immigrant, he wanted it operated on the secular philosophy dominant in France during the French Enlightenment, and the same philosophy embraced by many schools today. Run by the city of Philadelphia, this school operated on the notion that students could successfully learn morality apart from the Bible. In fact, the school even adopted a policy prohibiting Christian ministers from setting foot on campus. This policy, perceived as an attempt to keep the Bible from students, became an issue at the U.S. Supreme Court. And when the court issued its final decision, the ruling was unanimous and was delivered by Justice Joseph Story, called a father of American jurisprudence, who was placed on the court by President James Madison. In that unanimous decision, the Supreme Court made this declaration that's very surprising today. Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the school, its general precepts expounded, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? The Supreme Court of the United States unanimously held that this government-run school should teach the Bible, the source of what it called, quote, the purest principles of morality. Modern rulings are exactly the opposite, but few today realize that earlier courts whose justices were appointed by Founding Fathers, have already ruled on the same issues. There are literally dozens of such rulings, including one by the 1811 New York Supreme Court, a ruling subsequently cited by the U.S. Supreme Court as an authority for its own decisions. That New York case dealt with a man who had distributed a writing full of vulgar, malicious, and gratuitous profanity, attacking God, Jesus Christ, and the Bible. He was fined and punished, and on appeal, the state Supreme Court upheld the conviction, stressing, whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government. According to the court, an attack on Christianity was an attack on the foundation of our country and its government, and the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. A good challenge for all folks deals with a book that they can get today and read. It's called The Two Treatises of Government by John Locke. That book was originally written in 1690 in England. And John Locke is the guy who wrote the Constitution of Carolina. I mean, John Locke had an impact on the founding of America, but he's a theologian in Great Britain. He's an attorney. He does a lot of legal work. And he wrote a book that the Founding Fathers used in writing the Declaration. Matter of fact, if you read the writings of the Founding Fathers, people like John Witherspoon, John Adams, others, they say that they relied on the works of John Locke to write the Declaration. Richard Henry Lee, the guy who made the motion in Congress that we separate from Great Britain, who signed the Declaration, He said they copied the Declaration of Independence out of Locke's two treatises of government. Now, here's Locke's two treatises of government right there. That's 1765. That's what they used in writing the Declaration. It's a little book. You can see it's not very thick. This is still reprinted today. We used to teach it in our schools. We don't teach it anymore. Americans ought to read this book. This is the book they used to write the Declaration. This book cites the Bible over 1,500 times to show the proper operation of civil government. That's what they used to write the Declaration.
Where can we find that?
Anywhere you want to go, you'll find this book. It's reprinted. It's available today. It is.
Can I just have that one?
This is a good one. But this is the
original one.
source of ideas for John Wise,
Wow.
John Locke. It was theologians, it was ministers who wrote the books that they used to write our documents. 1,500 Bible verses in this one verse that they used to incorporate to write the Declaration of Independence.
I'm always wondering, okay, what do we do? You know, how can we fix it? Can we talk about you writing
first thing to do to fix it is to read it.
Okay.
Go back and see what's there, because this is available. Second thing to do is take what we learn and start telling others.
Right.
Song of Solomon 8:13 says, your friends listen to your voice,
Yeah.
therefore speak. And if we start telling people, do you know the Declaration of Independence, the longest ongoing document we have in world history, was done because of theologians and the Bible, and tell people about that, it changes their whole attitude.
Yeah.
Now, this, because it's history, we can get it back in textbooks.
Right.
And we're starting to do that. I work with a lot of states to write textbooks, and there are textbooks that have come out now, contemporary textbooks that are putting this stuff back in it, where that our current kids are learning what we haven't learned for 50, 60, 70 years. And that's a step in the right direction.
Yes.
The takeaway is that the Bible was the source of the sermons that were the source of the inspiration of the ideas that created America.
That's exactly right. Clinton Rossiter said that if you took away John Adams and John Hancock and Sam Adams, the course of the revolution would have been identical because of what had been preached in the pulpit, what had been preached by the pastors out of the Bible. The ideas didn't come from all these patriots. The ideas came out of the Bible. They were articulated by the ministers. They were also articulated by the patriots. But if you take the patriots away, you still get the same consequence.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.